I'm Bradley Verdell. You are watching Authors Recommend Books, Episode 3. With me, back again, is Mark Will, poet and author. And what book are you in this week?
Well, I'm the co-editor of this new poetry anthology. It's called Forms of Formosa. At the moment, it's only available in Taiwan, but it will soon be on Amazon, so watch for that.
Yes, I had the great pleasure of going to one of the reading events for this book. And Formosa, for those of you who don't know, refers to Taiwan. It was the Portuguese, right? That called it
Ilha Formosa.
Ilha Formosa, right? Beautiful island, right? Which is Taiwan, where we live. And it's getting hot in Taiwan. A good time to go to a coffee shop and read. So we've got some book recommendations for you today. Before I recommend the books, I just want to remind you that these books are not paid promotions. These are just books that we've read and we like. In the case of the book I'm going to recommend today, the author is unknown and dead. So there's no way they could be paying me to recommend their book.
It's anonymous then?
Yeah, the author is a traveler. So didn't want to reveal his identity. So there you go. This channel is not monetized as of right now. So these are just books that we like and we think you should read. We've got one nonfiction recommendation for you and one fiction recommendation for you, as usual. So I will go first with my nonfiction recommendation. Oh, I forgot to mention, I am the author of the Chadwick Yates series of books and soon to be other steampunk fantasy and 19th century fantasy stories.
Which one is this?
This is book 4, Chadwick Yates and the Ascent of Dolomtiad, which is a fictional mountain that's sort of like Kilimanjaro. Alright, so the book I'm going to recommend today, Future Me, put that right here, it doesn't really have a fancy cover. It's called The Art of Dueling by a Traveler. I love dueling and reading about dueling. I've read 3, maybe 4 books about dueling at this point, and it comes up in fiction from the era that I'm writing in all the time. Obviously, right? So dueling is a huge. It's in the very recent past, and it seems like it's from another world, doesn't it? Dueling. Like, would you ever duel someone?
I don't know. I mean, I guess if they piss me off enough, maybe I would consider it.
H. Rider Haggard has a line that I really love in, I think it's Alan. Yeah, it's in Alan Quatermain, where he says, "Oh, you rich people in England, you think you're so much better than the Zulu in Africa." But he says, what about you think your black sister with her beads dancing around the fire is savage, but what are those pretty stones around your neck? Referring to the diamond jewelry and all this. They have a strong family resemblance, don't they? And then he says, and you, good sir, if you're eating your scientific dinner at your club, which costs a fortune, could keep a family for a week. If someone came up to you and punched you in the face while you're eating dinner, we'll see how much of a savage there is in you. There's something to that, right? There's something to I think one time I was at a nightclub. I was dancing. And my then girlfriend, there was a guy trying to get close to her, trying to dance, and she sort of refused him. And then he
This was here?
No, this was back in Tennessee.
Okay.
And he tried to kind of get close to her again, and I just I thought, there's a time when you just don't want to go to the bouncer or the security and say, "Hey, that guy's bothering me." So I was just like, "Do we need to talk about this outside? Do you want to go outside and talk about this?" And then he completely backed off and let us alone. But that's the closest I've ever come to a duel. I'm probably getting beat up really badly. But
what would your weapon of choice be?
Well, you get searched for weapons before you go into the club. So
I mean, if you did engage in a duel,
pistols for sure. Yeah. Oh yeah. I'd rather be shot than run through with a sword or something. Anyway, I'm pretty sure I read this book because I read another book about dueling called Gentleman's Blood by Barbara Holland, and I think she referenced this book in it. I said, I should go read that book. I may recommend her book in the future as well. It was very good. But anyway, The Art of Dueling is a very short book. In my first recommendation, I gave a modern instructional book about sailing, and then a modern instructional book about something antique, something historical, with the alcohol mantle lantern book that I recommended last time. So here we have a instructional volume that is historic about a historic art, right? So the author is writing in the time period that this is going on. This book was published in 1836. The first editions came out in 1836. We don't know who the author was. He calls himself a traveler. He was obviously from England. He was obviously rich, well-to-do, traveling the world, and upper class, because he was engaged in duels and assisting at duels. The book works backward a bit. It starts kind of from the shooting itself, and then it goes backwards to, oh, by the way, here's how to choose a second, and this is how you send a polite note informing others that you want to duel, and things like that. So, great book. As with all books from this time period, I really enjoy the author's style, and I really just enjoy the attitudes that are expressed in it. They're comical in a modern context, but he's being dead serious. You know,
what are the characteristics of this style?
Yeah, I would just say it's, you know, it's kind of like if you were to read like letters written by Civil War soldiers. They have this very flowing, erudite style that seems much more literate than the way people write today. You know, it's much more complex. He has long paragraphs with lots of extra information between. There's a lot of punctuation through it, commas and semicolons. There's these long flowing sentences with a lot of dependent clauses and things like that. But anyway, he says early in the book, the art. Oh, and he also prefers the pistol. So if you're going to duel somebody, pistol is the way to go. That's his preferred method at this time period, right? So that's what they're doing.
I need to practice before I tried that.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you exactly how to practice. This is one of the most fantastic parts of this book. He says, this is a quote, "The art of handling firearms I have always considered a very necessary branch of the education of a youth." I wish people today still thought that way. I do think the youth should be taught how to handle firearms. He notices that Americans learn shooting very early, and he says, that's a disadvantage to us in England. He says the Americans and the Germans are brought up handling firearms, so they're crack shots as adults, and we in England often lose that, by this time period. He writes this book because he says there's nothing else written on the subject at this time. So he says, a lot of people are dueling. I don't see any handbook on dueling, so I'm going to write one for the public good of people need to know the rules. And he thinks a lot of bad situations can be better handled if people know what's going on. He mentions, though, he mentions the arguments of people who are against dueling. He said, which he's not, by the way. He says, the practice is severely censured by all religious and thinking people. But then he goes on to say his perspective, which he says, the loss of a few lives is a mere trifle when compared with the benefits resulting to society at large. And what he means by that is the politeness and maintenance of honor that occurs when people know that they can be called out for a duel if they trespass. You'd be a lot more civil to people if you knew that, if you insult them or lie about them or slander them, they're going to call you out for a duel, and we've sort of, lost that. So in his view,
can't buy your way out of it.
You can't buy your way out of it. That's right.
Pay someone off.
That's right. And that's something that Barbara Holland mentions in her excellent book about dueling. She says, it's, and he scoffs at that. I'll actually get to that in a moment. He scoffs at the idea of a system run by money, which is what we have, right? The idea that you sue someone and there's months of legal proceedings in court and it's just soul draining, and they would rather just,
and it's all corrupted too.
And it's corrupted, right? There's no. Anyway, he makes another thing he says that I think is interesting when he says dueling needs to be preserved. He thinks it does more good for society than harm. He says, and this sounds similar to modern gun control arguments. Actually, you often hear people who are pro-gun say, well, the highways are still open. A lot of people die on the interstate every year, but those don't get closed down. He says, so this is funny, he says, the man who falls in a duel and the individual who is killed by the overturn of a stagecoach are both unfortunate victims to a practice from which we derive great advantages. It would be absurd to prohibit stage traveling because occasionally a few lives are lost by an overturn. Which is it's just funny how things, go like that throughout time. But going back to the legal thing, he says, nothing, in my opinion, is more horribly degrading to human nature than the plan adopted in this country of awarding an individual a pecuniary, which means monetary, compensation for the most cruel injury that can be inflicted. And I would sooner read the account of the death of a whole regiment by dueling than see recorded one of those disgusting trials which are a disgrace to our national character. And he means that sort of...
Sounds like he was in court himself.
He may have been. We don't know. Yeah. He despises the, legalese, the richest man with the best lawyer is going to win, kind of situation. And like you said, being rich doesn't get you out of it. In fact, if you're born a gentleman, if you're born rich, you're the only one who's expected to duel. Lower class people are not, honor is perceived to be something only those born noble have. At this time. And I just want to point, this is not in the book, but I do think there is something interesting to note about dueling in the U.S. and how it spread to the U.S. From this European sort of long tradition of nobles and monarchs engaging in it, is that Americans kind of had a choice when they set up a more egalitarian society where there's not going to be a noble class and an underclass. So we're all going to be equal. Now, if we're all going to be equal, and in the past, only the nobles could bear arms. I mean, this goes all the way back to swords and lances. If you're a knight, you couldn't carry a sword in most of in European feudalism. You couldn't really have arms even before the advent of the gun, really, if you weren't noble.
Right. So
Americans have that situation. Well, are we going to say nobody has to duel and nobody has to have weapons because nobody has honor? Or are we going to say that we are all nobles, therefore we all have honor and anyone can duel? And America chose the latter because you start to see people from all classes, newspaper editors and working class people take up dueling once the world becomes more egalitarian. Whereas in the past, if you're a laborer, and not a gentleman who doesn't have to work, you weren't expected to duel. You weren't expected to preserve your honor because you didn't have honor. So honor sort of came down to people who hadn't had it before. So that's just something interesting to note. But
do you think trial by, because essentially this is a kind of trial by combat, do you think that results in a greater amount of justice in the world? Or would
I want to see it?
I'm guessing he would say that it does, right? But I mean, we all admit that today, now, in contemporary society, the world is filled with injustice, right?
Yeah.
So would it be a more just world if we reverted back to this trial by combat?
Man, it's hard to say. I said that's the kind of question that keeps me up at night, thinking about it, because you have so many great thinkers who spoke so vehemently against dueling when it was being practiced. And there's a part of me that says, look, people who lived through it are telling future generations, don't do this. This is
Who, for example?
I think Benjamin Franklin, for example, was very against. A lot of early sort of famous, statesmen and people. But there's another side to this, which is that the author of this book duly notes that you got to look at who's trying to take dueling away. Well, the church is against dueling because, and that comes, and he, in his view, that comes from the Christian virtue of turning the other cheek. If somebody wrongs you, you just take it. You just let yourself be humiliated. It's Christ-like to be humiliated for a Christian. But I'm not saying he wasn't a Christian, but he's saying, that's not for me. And also the government.
How about for you?
For me?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Are you willing to turn the other cheek and be humiliated?
No, probably not. I mean, in serious matters, I'd say no. I mean, I love making fun of myself, as you know. I mean, I do, but I do think, I think there's no honor in victimhood. Doesn't give you honor. You know what I mean? I don't think. Like, have you ever met an old person who, I've met some people who are just very advanced in years, and they're so wise and full of life and optimism, And then I've met other people who you say, "Oh, how are you doing today?" And they start telling you about all their health problems and all the things they can't do. And I'm such a, "Oh, it's so hard. It's so hard." I think I don't have that sort of disposition where I think I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm not articulating this very well, but I don't think claiming victimhood gives me some sort of advantage. In other words, if it comes down to self-defense, for example, I'm gonna defend myself.
Right.
I don't think there's an interesting thing he mentions in this book about knighthood back in the old days. Like Lancelot days. About the process of becoming a knight, where the knight would spend a night by the altar, and they would go through all these rituals with priests and whatnot, and they're supposed to defend the innocent and the downtrodden and women and children and the elderly and those who are oppressed, ideally, right? And there's a part of that where one of the priests slaps the knight on the cheek, and that is the last insult they are allowed to tolerate. After that, you must defend your honor. You're not allowed to let your honor be degraded by someone else. It's a symbol of, okay, note this moment, slap. That is the last time someone will slap you and get away with it. And I think, I think people who say, oh, I could never be violent, even in retaliation. I could never pick up a gun. I think, well, no, I think if somebody was breaking down the door and your wife and children were in the house, you have an obligation to, I'm not Jesus. I'm not willing to be tortured and crucified to prove how great I am. I think when the chips are down, I think I think I would go the way of the traveler here in this case.
The slap in the face reminds me of a story that the mythologist Joseph Campbell told.
Oh, Joseph
Campbell. There was and I'm not sure it has the same significance, but it's an interesting story. So a samurai was told to kill his master's enemy, I guess it was. So he because I think his master's enemy had killed his master, something like that. So he stalks his enemy. He finds him. He's about to kill him. He's drawn his sword, and then the enemy is so terrified that he spits in his face. Okay, and then the samurai sheathes his sword and walks away. Now, why did he do that? Because he had become angry. He had become emotional, and so it was no longer an honor killing. His personal emotion became involved, and so he couldn't do it. Like you can't do it. You can't do it if there's some sort of personal emotional investment in it. But with dueling, it seems that's the whole point, right? Like there is. Oh, there's our friend again. Yeah. There is some sort of emotional trigger, right? Like if it's the guy that's trying to dance with your girlfriend, that's personal, and you're actually angry. There is an emotional involvement. But then I wonder when you formalize it, when you formalize this grievance, and then you engage in the ritual of dueling, how does that change it? Like it?
Yeah. Oh, that's
it
huge.
Socializes it.
It's huge. No, but it civilizes it. I mean, this is something. I said I've read 3 or 4 books about dueling. Here's something I've come away with. And think about how different our legal system is today than the social culture of dueling then, right? Cold-bloodedness is prized by the upper classes who are using dueling. So like today, right? Like today, if somebody attacks me, right, and I respond in self-defense, and I really hurt them, I break their jaw, but they get injured, and I say, well, or maybe they just insult me in a grievous way, he grabs my girlfriend's ass or something, and I punch him, and then that would be seen as a circumstance favorable to me. I could say, oh, it was just in the heat of passion I did this, and that would reduce my guilt in the eyes of the court, right?
Yeah,
Whereas if he grabs my girlfriend's ass and I say, hey, Mark, be my second. Here, I've written this note. I want you to take it to him, and next Saturday I want to meet in the woods and murder him, and duel him, and then we do the duel and I kill him. Nowadays, that would be seen as premeditated, cold-blooded murder, right? But in that time period, you lose face, you lose honor if you show emotion, right? So if the guy says, I'm playing cards, right, and my opponent accuses me of cheating, if I bang my fist on the table and punch him in the face or throw my drink, I've lost my honor, I've lost my face, I've lost my social, what would you call it? Social
status.
So
yeah,
exactly.
You mean in the context of this dueling society,
in the context of dueling.
Not now.
Right,
it's like
not now. Right.
Now.
It's the reverse of that now.
So I guess that's what I was getting at with the story of the samurai. I mean, the
self-control.
Yeah,
you have to show self-control.
Yeah. So in a way, the dueling culture was more like Japanese samurai culture.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and that's what's so fascinating about dueling too, is that it's so universal. It pops up in so many different cultures. It's what do you do before you have a police justice system? And this is basically an anarchist kind of view of justice. If there's no religion and if there's no government, swift justice is going to be done in a way like this. I mean, this is what you would get. If you don't have security cameras everywhere and trial by jury of your peers and all that kind of stuff and fair representation and all that. This is a shortcut, and it's swift justice. But self-control is at the core of it. So again, I have to step back from the situation, cool down, get someone to be my go-between, have a letter exchange, and a lot of these, and a traveler, he says, make sure all the notes and letters you send to the person you're challenging or who challenges you are polite. They would say, dear honorable sir, and then talk about their, and everything. If you read these dueling cartels, they go back and forth, and some of them are just they go for months and months at a time, and many pages of letters. They're so unfailingly polite, and they're talking about meeting to try to kill each other. Whereas today we seem to put value on, well, you couldn't control your emotions, so that's okay. And in that time period, it's you didn't control your emotions, you lose. That's it. You should have cooled down and and if you wanted to have it out, you shouldn't have punched him in the bar. You should have dueled him properly and politely and done it that way. So it's a fascinating reversal of culture. But
yeah.
Another thing to be said about this book is there's a lot of funny observations about different cultures that he makes that I find so funny reading about this time period. Like, he said, in England, if 2 men quarrel, they box. For every man is more or less a boxer, and after hammering at one another until all animosity is vented, they shake hands and part, perhaps with a black eye, a broken nose, or a sprained wrist. But it is rarely that any serious injury is sustained by either. And then he says, but in France, the French box, but they kick and scratch and bite and do all this. And it's terrible, and they need to become more civilized. And I hope our culture of boxing will overthrow their unsavory French method of boxing. And he talks about how he says if two Italians or Portuguese quarrel, their knives are displayed in a moment. And he says, this is not good because usually one or both of them die. And then he says he's in Rio at one point, and he says, oh yeah, the police just don't investigate anything. He's like, I saw knife murders done, and the police never bother, and he thinks it's all corrupt, and he's really saying England is the best. Is what he's saying. As far as dueling goes, he thinks the most civilized and polite.
And as an Anglophile yourself, I'm sure you appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate how codified and it's dueling in England is sort of like cricket and snooker. It has these elaborate technical strategic rules. They sort of look down on anything that's sort of a quick all and out brawl. Everything has to be done ship shape and proper. Then, okay, so I got to get to the meat of the book. I don't want to take too much. I have so many. I could talk about this book all day, but it's just fantastic. But something I want to mention really fast, and then I'll get to the final philosophical point that I want you to sound off on. But also, back to the religion thing for a moment. He thinks that priests shouldn't be free to insult because priests weren't expected to duel in this time. So a priest you couldn't issue a challenge to a priest, and he couldn't issue a challenge to you. So basically, he doesn't like that priests can say whatever you want and say whatever they want and get away with it.
Right.
Priests can do whatever they want and they don't get called out. So he thinks, people should be able to call out priests and vice versa. So I get the feeling he was not a very religious man. Yeah, I talked about the slap. Yeah, so getting into the meat of the book, he gets into how to practice and prepare for a duel. So let's say you're going to have a pistol duel tomorrow. How would you go about preparing and practicing?
I guess I'd need to do some target practice tonight.
Yeah.
Like a lot. Because I haven't shot a gun in a long time, so
yeah, especially a smoothbore percussion cap, right?
Well, yeah, I'd be worried about my technique.
Yeah, so he starts with recommending some equipment. He recommends pistol dueling, obviously, over swords and other methods. He recommends that you get yourself a set of dueling pistols with percussion locks, 10-inch barrels, octagonal, preferably made by Purdy, which is you might not know this, but Purdy is a legendary gun maker.
Okay.
He says Purdy of Oxford Street makes the best locks. No silver sights. Don't you dare buy a gun with silver sights. Get you some nice blue steeled sights, because the silver can dazzle your eyes, and you don't want your eyes dazzled. Obviously, they have to be smoothbore. They can't be rifled, because then that's too accurate, and then that, the element of luck and fate gets taken out of it a bit.
Right.
Says if you're going to duel at 50 paces, then by all means, rifled barrels. But at 10 to 14 paces, he thinks it doesn't add any accuracy to have rifled barrels. But anyway, hair triggered and balanced. You don't want the gun to be balanced so that the muzzle is too heavy and you have to shake and strain your arm to hold it outright. So you want it to have a nice balance in your hand. Perhaps getting a gun made for you would be the way to go. He has an entire chapter on how to charge the pistol, which is kind of a forgotten art. So you got to remember, in this day, being a gun owner, a lot of the accuracy and your skill is just putting the right amount of powder. I mean, you got to put in the powder and everything, and these are muzzle loaders now. You can't just put in a piece of manufactured ammunition, cartridge and fire away. He talks about charging the pistol. He says, look, you want to fire at an iron target at dueling pace, and you want the piece of lead to ping the iron target, and when it hits the ground, it should be about the size of a shilling. If it explodes, you've used too much powder. If the lead ball just kind of goes everywhere.
Right.
You want it to just flatten to the size of a shilling when it hits the floor. He says, and this is firearms tip, a tip that's still given today, which is that like when I go clay shooting sometimes, when you look at the clay, you don't want to just think, oh, there goes an orange frisbee, I'm going to hit that. You want to look at the leading edge. You want to try to see the groove on the clay. Pick something. So he says, don't just look at the guy you're shooting. Pick out one gilt button on his coat and try to hit, the top edge of that button. You want to really focus on what you're focusing on.
Let me write that down.
Yeah, you better write that down.
I got to prepare for
your duel.
upcoming duel.
Probably with another author, about you stole my novel or something. Method of practice. He's got a chapter called Method of Practice, which is absolutely fascinating insight. Okay, so here's what you do. He says, look, if you're going to be traveling around and you're a young, noble gentleman and you might get challenged or you might have to challenge someone, you want to know what you're doing. So he says, you got to find a place with a backstop. Obviously, you gotta, when you're shooting, you've got to have a wall or a earthen mound or something so that your stray bullets don't hit innocent bystanders. Get you a good backstop. Hang up a round piece of cast iron 3 feet in diameter. Procure a box of white wafers. Place 24 wafers in 3 rows. So you got a grid of 8 by 3 white wafers on this cast iron 3-foot diameter gong or piece of iron. You're going to stand at between 14 and 15 paces, and you're going to pick off these crackers. Never hesitate more than 2 or 3 seconds after you raise your hand. And he goes on to say, until a man can culp 12 wafers at 14 yards in 6 minutes, loading the pistols himself between each discharge, I do not consider him proficient in pistol practice. So you need to get to the point where you can knock out 12 wafers in 6 minutes at 14 yards, and then you'll be ready. He says, I should advise a young practitioner to get up and pick off 5 or 6 dozen wafers in this way every morning before breakfast. In 3 months, if a clever fellow, he will become quite au fait, or skilled. You'll be ready to go.
I wonder how many of these guys, after they've trained for so long, if they don't use the training, what's the point? So eventually, they're going to go looking for trouble.
Yeah,
If you've got a lot of these guys that are so skilled, they're going to want to demonstrate their skills. So they're going to. I would think that it would create an environment which made these duels much more likely. People would be more hostile, even though. And again, maybe that's similar to the samurai culture, right? Those guys were hacking each other to pieces all the time. So even though there's this outward sort of, this outward culture of honor and restraint, it's actually quite savage, and it's
And that is a problem, because he mentions that after this war, the French, who were former soldiers and quite skilled with weapons, they loved to go and pick a fight with English tourists just for revenge. They'd pick a young, fresh-faced guy who couldn't have much experience of the world and say, all right, let's get this guy in a duel, and just to kind of cull the ranks. So that's true. I mean, it starts out as, well, my son might have to duel, so I'm going to send him to fencing school and have him practice with the pistol. And then it could turn into, well, an arms race of skill, basically, where everyone in the noble classes is, ready to fight and defend. But that's the balance, right? Is that it could become a mutually assured destruction thing, where, okay, all of us are very skilled, so I can't. I'm skilled, but so is everybody else. So if I challenge him, chances are still 50-50.
Right.
But he doesn't want you to be uninitiated and go. He's trying to save you from going up against someone who's much more skilled.
From being the British tourist that gets picked on by.
Exactly, because he is English, and he says this is advice for continental tourists. Now, the other thing is, he says it's about nerve. And his other, this is brilliant. He wants you to, in your yard, on your grounds somewhere, erect a dummy that is holding a pistol. And you're going to charge the pistol with powder, but obviously don't put a bullet in it. And you're going to have it aimed at you while you're practicing. You're going to use a piece of whipcord to set the trigger. And then as you fire, you're going to take you're going to tie the string to yourself. Mm-hmm. As you fire, step back so that the gun discharges at you. He wants you to train looking at a barrel pointed at you that's going to go off so that you get desensitized to the bang and the flash and looking at a gun barrel. So you don't put a bullet in it, but you get used to, okay, I've got to fire. I've got to be able to fire when I could be about to get shot. I've got to be able to look at a guy pointing a gun at me about to fire and still... Because these guns are hair triggered, okay? If you're nervous and you're flinching, you're going to set it off.
Oh, yeah.
And then you're going to miss, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the hair trigger thing, is that it's supposed to be a test of who can keep their cool.
Right.
Who can be calm under pressure. Who can treat it like... I mean, because it's a test of courage, right? It's a test of courage. Last thing about the practice, he also talks about if you're going to fight with swords, you want to get an iron spring... and you want to bolt that by a plate into your wall, put a sword in it, and spend an hour at a time whacking the sword so that you get used to a blade waving around in front of you. Sharp blade, So you want to just hit it, and let it bounce around on the spring so you get used to a sharp thing waving around in front of you. So a lot of it's about desensitizing yourself to danger, right? He recommends swords from Toledo, Spain. Actually, the odds in dueling are pretty good. According to him, he studied 200 duels and determined you have only a 1 in 14 chance of being killed and only a 1 in 6 chance of being hit. Okay. So odds are in your favor. You're rolling a 6-sided die. Only one side means you get shot, and you only got a 1 in 14 chance of being killed. A lot of people delope. They fire up in the air. They fire at the ground. They intentionally, they kind of acknowledge this is, okay, we've both shown our courage. Now let's move on. It's not really worth it. And I think that's the thing, is that you and I might have a heated argument, but when you're pointing a gun at me and I'm pointing a gun at you, we might suddenly decide to let it go. And I think dueling, whereas 9 months of legal proceedings is just going to make us hate each other even more, right? Like, there's not going to be a handshake in friendship at the end of that.
Right.
But many people have boxed, and, you break my nose and I sprain your wrist, and when we're done, we're friends again, Same with dueling, where you might fire into the ground, and then I fire to the side, and then we've both defended our honor, and we let it go, and we can be friends again. We haven't lost face.
Right.
This is just the funniest part. Okay, before a duel, let's say you've got a duel tomorrow, so here's what I want you to do. Declare war against nervous apprehension. Maybe invite some friends to dinner. Laugh the evening away. Okay, if you're fond of cards, play a rubber of whist. Isn't that brilliant? You've got a duel tomorrow. You guys want to come over and play whist? Okay, avoid bilious foods. If you can't go to sleep, perhaps read one of Sir Walter's novels or those of Byron until you drop asleep. Make sure, I'll be your servant. Okay, your servant, I'm going to call you at 5 with a strong cup of coffee. I want you to take that cup of coffee immediately upon rising.
Can I have tea instead?
No.
Oh.
No, you may not. Coffee and a biscuit. Don't eat more than that, though, because if you get shot in the stomach on a full stomach, that's not good. Okay, I want you to douse your eyes with cold water so that you'll be bright-eyed and, well, not bushy-tailed, but he said, it's not true what the Italians say about us British. We can do things well with our stomachs not full of roast beef. If you smoke, take a cigar. When you get to the dueling ground, puff on your cigar as you wait for the seconds to arrange things. Don't tell your wife and children. Sneak out of the house, much like Commodore Stephen Decatur did before his fatal duel. Don't upset your family, because your wife and children will cry and plead and get emotional, and then you'll get nervous and emotional, right? You'll be affected. Sure. So just don't tell anybody about your duel. If it's the summer, you should have your duel at 6 a.m. In the spring and autumn, 7 a.m. In the winter, 8 a.m. Go in a post-chase. When you're driving to the field of honor, if you feel nervous, take you a bottle of soda water, mix it with a wine glass of brandy. A traveler says, quote, I can strongly recommend it as a most grateful stimulant and corrective. And, most importantly, when you get there, walk up to your spot to duel as if you were walking up to shake hands with a friend, rather than to kill one. If you are hit, just submit to your surgeon. Don't be upset or alarmed, he says. If you die, quote, go off with as good a grace as possible. And he mentions a case where one man was fatally shot, and the last thing he said was, by George, I've missed him. Now, the final philosophical point I wanted to sound you off on was, I thought, well, there's so many philosophical things to think about. But, where was it? My notes are all over the place. He says, we talk about the balance of, well, the government doesn't want people dueling because the government wants to have a monopoly on violence and justice, right? And corruption for that matter, right? So he says, it's a little bit suspicious that the government doesn't want us to duel. And it's suspicious that the church doesn't want us to duel because this is sort of private justice. And they don't want private justice. They want, other people want their hands in it, right? And there's a lot, there's upsides and downsides. Like I said, we don't live with a dueling culture. If we did for a week, we might hate it. We might think, oh, this is the worst thing ever. There's a lot of smart people on both sides of the debate about dueling. But the Victorians did not believe in utopia. That's something that I get from this guy and so many books that I read from this time period. He says, there can be no perfect happiness in this world. And I think, if you've read Animal Farm and Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World and 1984 and books like this, that the 20th century is just a record of people trying to make utopia and it being a complete nightmare. And thank God that we have literature that tells us how utterly foolish it is to try to be, utopian. And I think a traveler doesn't have any illusions about utopia. He's saying, look, there may be no perfect system here. We just said, a system where people sue each other all the time, and it's about who's the richest person, who has the best law. So something terrible might happen to me. I might have to crowdfund to get a lawyer so I can even sue someone.
Right.
So that's not a great system. It's also not a great system. Dueling's not a great system. All these things are not a great system. He's just trying to dial in. It's like a combination lock. You can dial it too far one way and too far another way. But if perfection is not on that dial, you've just got to find a balance, that's acceptable. And I think that's something that's always worth remembering. That just this how many failed states started with a vision of utopia, and he doesn't have those illusions, I don't know. What do you think about that? And also the other thing that you might want to give your thoughts on is something that these sort of authors that I like to read, for these 19th century authors, they're often very fatalistic. Mm-hmm. They're either religious and they believe, okay, dueling is a chance for God to show who's right. God will make it so that the righteous person wins. At least that's, the
that's
trial.
That's an extraordinary leap of faith.
Yeah, trial by combat and all that stuff. And I think modern people don't buy into that. And if you're not fatalistic and you say, well, if you sort of take the path in life that, well, maybe when I suffer it's just because I did something really stupid and I should have planned, but it actually makes you second guess and doubt yourself a lot more. But it sometimes prevents you from doing really courageous things. You just think, oh, I'll screw it up, So sometimes I wish I could be more fatalistic, Like when I'm surfing or rock climbing or doing dangerous things. I think you can be more bold when you just say, well, it's all fate, It's not in my hands. Better just courageously meet it.
Right.
There are advantages in that,
Well, I think the topic of utopia is something that we might explore in a later video. Mm-hmm. The genre of dystopian literature is of great interest to me, but maybe we'll save that for another day. Yeah.
That's good. I have gone pretty long on this one. I just think this book it's hilarious, and it's also an interesting look into the mindset of a very different culture that's not that far in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, 5 stars for A Traveler, whoever he was. All right. What do you got for us today?
Well, I've got a 5-star book as well, and it is written by a canonical author.
What, pray tell, is a canonical author? You mean it's in the Bible, right? That's what canonical means.
No. I mean, I think this particular author, it's Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is generally thought to be canonical by, I guess, the reading public and literary scholars and so on. But I would say,
right?
Yeah, but when I use that term, I'm talking about my own personal canon.
Okay.
So for me, he is a canonical author, and by that I mean I want to read everything he's written, because even when I'm reading a work of his which is not excellent, I feel that I still benefit. I mean, Garcia Marquez is the author of 100 Years of Solitude, of course, and that is like the epic, the Iliad and Odyssey, the War and Peace of Latin America. So the person who wrote this book, I want to know, I want to read everything he's written if possible. And in addition to 100 Years of Solitude, he wrote the brilliant Love in the Time of Cholera, which is an excellent example of magic realism, as is 100 Years of Solitude. But it's most important in literary history because it inspired the title of my song, Love in the Time of Tuberculosis.
Instead of cholera.
Yeah, okay. Which, by the way, you can read in this collection. So the lyrics to Love in the Time of Tuberculosis, inspired by Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera, is in this book, Forms of Formosa. But I digress.
Let's see this book. I mean, well,
yeah, well,
it's up on screen, but
the one I want to talk about today is The Autumn of the Patriarch.
Okay.
And this is a 5-star novel for sure. But I want to back up a bit and talk about my experience, my own personal reading experience with Garcia Marquez.
Great.
So I think the first thing that I read was a novella called Chronicle of a Foretold Death, which is also excellent. Later, I read 100 Years of Solitude, Love in the Time of Cholera, all excellent. So
when you say later, do you mean like immediately after? Like you read one and you immediately got the other, or you just...
No, I think I first read Chronicle of a Foretold Death at university, and then maybe...
Was it required reading?
No, I just I had a Mexican friend that was a student of Latin American literature, and he introduced me to a lot of great Latin American authors, and so that was the first Garcia Marquez I was exposed to. There's actually a pretty good movie version of that book, and so we just happened to watch the film, and then I was like, yeah, I'm going to read the book too, because this is a great
And I bet
story.
the book was better.
Yeah, it was. The movie's good too, but it's an excellent novella. So then, yeah, later, I read 100 Years of Solitude, that should be required reading for everyone on the planet.
Everyone.
Yeah. Love in the Time of Cholera, also excellent. So, he's a canonical author for me. I want to read everything I can by Garcia Marquez. So recently,
has he written a lot of books? I mean, is it a big list?
Well, he's dead now, but he has not been as prolific as other Nobel Prize winning authors necessarily, but yeah, I mean, he's got a fairly large bibliography. So recently, I was at my favorite bookstore in Taipei, which is Bookman. Have you ever been there?
I believe I have.
Dongguan.
Yeah.
It's across from Taida, the National Taiwan University. The selection there I just find to be better than S-Light and caves. I mean, I've found a lot of great books there in Taiwan that I can't find elsewhere. But anyway, you can never have enough Garcia Marquez. So I bought 3 books there, and one of them was this novella, No One Writes to the Colonel. This is okay. It's not 5 stars.
It's very short, though.
Yeah, you can read it in a day. It's fine. Nothing spectacular. The General in His Labyrinth. It's somewhat unusual for Garcia Marquez because it's not magical realist at all. It's just pretty much a straightforward historical novel. And even though I would give this probably 3 stars, maybe 3.5 to 4 stars for this one, it's certainly not on the same level as the other great books of his that I mentioned. But it is interesting because the General, referred to in the title, is Simon Bolivar.
Oh,
who
okay.
is, you know, I mean,
that general.
If you're interested in the history of Latin America, it gives a very interesting perspective on the last. It's basically about the last days of Simon Bolivar and then his death. So it's not a fantastic book, but if you're interested in that period of history and this particular historical personage, I think it's worth reading. Okay, but I want to talk about this. This is a 5-star, unique, sui generis masterpiece.
Oh,
There's
sui generis.
Yeah, it's like of its own class.
Okay.
I mean, there's
nothing to compare
book
it to.
quite like this.
Okay.
I mean, technically, it's you could say that it's an example of the genre of the dictator novel. So that this is a Latin American genre. There are many novels written about dictators. Vargas Llosa wrote The Feast of the Goat about the Dominican dictator Trujillo, and that is a fantastic novel in itself. But it's written in it's pretty much straightforward historical fiction, but it details the whole conspiracy. Like some of the officers, some of the military officers revolted and they planned to assassinate him. So it's like a modern day Julius Caesar set in the Dominican Republic. It's excellent.
That's a great tagline, actually. That makes me really interested when you say it that way.
Yeah, it's great.
You should write blurbs.
Yeah, I'm digressing, but so there are a lot of examples of this in Latin American literature. These dictator novels, and so this is definitely one, but it's quite unique because it is written in the magical realist style. And I don't know, are you familiar with magical realism?
Yeah, a little bit, but I mean, let's define that term.
I mean, it's realistic, but it's also magical. Yeah. Like there are elements of the fantastic. Strange things are permitted to happen in the narrative. Mm-hmm. For instance, the dictator, the Patriarch, has a herniated testicle that he carries around with him in a little cart. There's mention of a girl who was turned into a scorpion because she disobeyed her parents. At one point, the Patriarch speculates that in the future, the poor people of his country will be born without an asshole. So there are all of these fantastic elements which are very characteristic of magical realism. I mean, I guess there are elements of what the Russian critic Bakhtin would call the carnivalesque. Mm-hmm. So it's like really comedic, absurdist, fantastic elements in an otherwise realistic narrative. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's not for everyone. Some people dislike it.
Yeah, I would say it's a love it or hate it kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like Hamlet in a way, right? Like you either like the fact that there's a ghost or you don't. You either think, oh, that ruins it. Why they have to bring a ghost into this? Or you think, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And you just go with it.
Yeah, it's realistic otherwise, but there's a ghost.
Yeah.
It tells you important things that you couldn't have known otherwise.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a good analogy. Although with magic realism, it's even more.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Hamlet is magical realism, but I mean, it's that love it or hate it thing.
It's a sort of. I mean, there are fantastic elements in otherwise realistic works of fiction, right? But with magic realism, they're quite quite prevalent. And so, another unique thing about this book is its style. It's written in a stream of consciousness style, very much. We know that Garcia Marquez was very much influenced by Virginia Woolf, and you can see that influence in The Autumn of the Patriarch. But also at times I was reminded of the work of James Joyce. And in a way, there were certain things in this book that reminded me of Finnegan's Wake. You've got these larger-than-life fictional characters that are almost mythical. Like the Patriarch is just... He's so larger than life that he takes on these, he's written as though he were a mythical character, and then the other characters in the book, members of his family or soldiers in the military, and then his enemies, they all have like this mythical and also dreamlike quality. So. It's not for everyone. I'm not sure everyone would like it. In a way, I think Garcia Marquez himself described it as a kind of prose poem. There are 4 or 5 very lengthy sections, but you really have to get into the rhythm of the narrative to appreciate it. For example, I remember reading one sentence that was probably about 20 pages.
Wow.
I mean, one sentence. Like it's just one long stream of consciousness before you get to a period. Wow. And then there are all these recurring images, the most memorable of which of course is the herniated testicle. I mean, it's so absurd. But this patriarch cannot die. Like, at one point he celebrates his 100th birthday, and he's still like the ruler of this unnamed Latin American nation. And so there were many models that it's believed Garcia Marquez drew from when he created the Patriarch as a character. Latin American dictators, but also at the time he was living in Spain, and so he drew from the character of Franco, right? Okay. Whom we mentioned in episode 2, right? One of Sartre's stories was set during the Spanish Civil War. So I would say it's not for everyone, but
everyone should try it.
I think so. I mean, if you've never read Garcia Marquez, I would say read 100 Years of Solitude first, and then maybe Love in the Time of Cholera. But if you like those and you want more Garcia Marquez, this is an excellent choice. The Autumn of the Patriarch, 5 stars, and quite a unique book. I mean, there's really nothing like it.
But I mean, what did it make you think about, like philosophically, or why does it stay on your mind after you read it? Like, can you sort of, like, without giving anything away? I mean, although I think spoilers are fine if you want to, but if you don't want to, can you tell us, like, oh, this will make you think about, an abstract?
In a way, the narrative is secondary. It's just I think it is a beautiful prose poem. So like with say Finnegan's Wake, the actual story is not that important. You just immerse yourself in the language and sort of go with the narrative flow. So if you don't appreciate, and this is an English translation, right? So the original Spanish would be a more authentic experience. But this is quite a good translation. I think it's let me see. Yeah, Gregory Rabasa has translated a lot of Latin American books, so it's quite well done. And even in English translation, you can sort of ride that. You can just be transported along this river of poetic prose. But if you're the sort of reader that needs a plot and narrative is more important, this may not be the book for you. But you should, I think everyone should try it, because it's
interesting, because a lot of people, the buzzword now is character driven fiction, and I'm a high school literature teacher, so I try to get this concept into my students. Like, I said, think of something where the character is all that matters to make the thing sell, and the plot is interchangeable. And they often say, well, superheroes. Every superhero story, it's like, oh, they made the 14th, Spider-Man movie, and people will go see it because it's Spider-Man, and the plot doesn't really matter.
Right.
Or Sherlock Holmes, if you like one Sherlock Holmes story, you're going to like the others. That some have better mystery plots than others, but if you like the character, you get into it. And then there's plot-driven fiction, where maybe the characters are not the most important thing, but the twists and turns of the plot itself are interesting. So are you saying this is more like the author's style is actually at the forefront?
I would say, yeah. So maybe there are at least three categories of fiction. The plot-driven narrative, the character-driven narrative, and I would say this is language-driven. It's really about the music of the prose. And so again, that's why I was reminded of Joyce, and in particular Finnegan's Wake, because if you think about the structure of Finnegan's Wake, it's like a circle, and you can just open to any page and just go, and you'll be just as, it's not quite as difficult and challenging as Finnegan's Wake, the Autumn of the Patriarch, I mean, but you could probably start with any of the major sections and just enjoy whatever passage you're reading without being too worried about what came before or what comes after, because it's basically a dictator that won't die, and he's oppressing his country. He dispatches his enemies. Their little subplots involving family members and people, like basically courtiers that are kissing his ass, So there's not much to the story.
Yeah.
It's like it's just an eternal dictator that'll never die. So it's more about the language and the poetic descriptions and the imagery, of course.
It sounds depressing, though. I mean, but is it depressing?
But it is. But it's like some of the descriptions of violence are pretty shocking. But it's always with that magical realist quality, which I find amusing and entertaining. Like some of the descriptions are so fantastic and outrageous that they're funny. It's absurdist. It's carnivalesque. Yeah. It reminds me. I mean, there are a lot of Latin American authors. The poet Neruda, for instance, a lot of his poetry is quite funny. Just the imagery and the language he uses to describe things, even when it's a subject that is depressing, like living under a dictatorship or struggling for democratic reforms or whatever, it's always entertaining and humorous at the same time. And some of that same style, I think, is on display here in the Autumn of the Patriarch, and in the work of Garcia Marquez in general.
What would you say? I mean, it's another question that I like to ask, students sometimes. Is what would you say is the mood of the story? Like, what's your emotional reaction? Like when you're reading it, what kind of mood does it put you in? Obviously, mood is subjective for different readers, but I mean, how do you feel when you're reading it?
Well, I feel like I need to concentrate and I need to have patience because with these long sentences, you don't know where you're going to go, and you don't know where the author is going to take you. So you just have to try to relax and concentrate at the same time and go with the narrative flow. And along the way, you'll see some very interesting sights, and there will be some. You will appreciate the poetic phrasing, and you'll just eventually enjoy the music of the prose.
Enjoy the music of the prose. I like it. Anything else on this one? I went for a long time. I feel embarrassed now.
No. I think I've said everything I want to say about it.
Okay. Well, good stuff. I highly recommend that you check these books out, both of them, and I also recommend that you check out Mark's books. The links will be in the description, and my books. I hope you're here on this channel because you've already read some of my books, but if you haven't, check them out. And we'll be back at you with more recommendations soon. As always, please subscribe to this channel. I'm trying to get 1,000 subscribers. This is only episode 3 of this playlist anyway. Please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it with all your friends and all your enemies.